It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, good day, listeners, and welcome to the Two Jacks, our combo version podcast where we go around the world and end up where I'm from, where Jack's from, but not where he lives. He's Hong Kong Jack, and he's living in Hong Kong. What's the day like there today, mate?
Well, we're getting closer to winter. We've had a couple of 13-degree days last week. That's a bit chilly. Our flat here is not really designed to keep the heat in. It's designed to keep the heat out. You know?
Right. So does it get cool? You need the heater? You need to pull out the electric heater?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, it's like a lot of Sydney houses are like that. They're not built with heating because it doesn't get that cold in Sydney. But where we are, it gets plenty cold. So there's always a great big open fire there. We're just going to kick it off just one of your drop kicks, one of your country boy drop kicks away in China, mainland China, and the death of Jiang Zemin, the president of China between, I think, 1992 and 2002, two-termer, and General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party between 1989 and 2002, died on the 30th of November. Jack, let's talk legacy about Jiang Zemin.
How will history treat him? Pretty well, I would think. He got off to a pretty slow start, in part because Deng Xiaoping was still the power behind the throne at that stage, and it looked like the economic reforms were stalling a bit. And Deng undertook what's still called the Great Southern Tour, where he came down and had a look around Shenzhen, which was still half rice paddies in those days, and Guangzhou, and he sort of rubber stamped the continuation of the economic reforms. And after that, Jiang Zemin, his career really took off. He was a very successful president, in my view.
Really opened up China's trade to the rest of the world, perhaps.
Even
more so than Deng Xiaoping. Yeah.
Well, Deng got it all set in train, but there was still stuff to do. Jiang Zemin managed to persuade the Europeans and the Americans to let China join the World Trade Organization, which is of huge benefit to China. And then, of course, he managed the handover here in Hong Kong very successfully. History will be treating him pretty kindly, I would think.
Pretty kindly. Spoke Japanese, perhaps not fluent, but he learnt it during Japanese occupation of large chunks of China.
He rather surprised his Japanese hosts at a meeting by rendering his name. The Chinese and the Japanese have very similar characters, and they can normally read each other's characters. And he surprised his Japanese host by rendering his own name in the way that a Japanese reader would say it. And he explained that he had learned Japanese during the 6 years of occupation, but he apologised that he wasn't entirely fluent because in those days he didn't have much time to study.
I think he would have been fighting for the removal of the Japanese. Also a big fan of Russian culture and a big fan of Tolstoy, perhaps more than Solzhenitsyn. And that's probably right too, because Solzhenitsyn... Have you ever read Solzhenitsyn, Jack? A little bit dreary, a little bit slow.
Yes. It requires patience.
It does require great patience. There's about 5 pages that he dedicates to
sort
watching
of
the hands move around a clock.
Sort of the Patrick White of Russia, really, isn't he?
He was indeed, but Tolstoy, a magnificent writer, and Jiang pronounced Tolstoy and Russian literature generally as great.
He learned his Russian working in a Russian factory in China, I might add.
So, multilingual, highly skilled and a great Chinese politician has left us. Jack, while we're on China, and this is probably the big story, is the approach to COVID changing? It seems to be. We've talked about protests last week in Shanghai in particular, and there were further protests later in the week. Is the government now responding to those concerns, or is it just deciding that there needs to be a different response to COVID?
Well, the usual caveat applies. It's always a little bit hard to know for sure when we're talking about what's happening over there. Certainly, in our neighbouring city here of Guangzhou, it's just up the Pearl River from where I'm sitting. About 22 million people, I think, live up there.
But you can't go. Well, you can go, but you'd have to wait a week to enjoy it.
Yeah. You used to be able to go pretty easily. It's about a bit over an hour on the fast train. But now it's a bit more difficult. They'd been locked down for some time, but they're all back at work as of last Monday. And that's a bit of a change. And one of the leading officials who's supposedly in charge of the COVID response managed to get through a whole press conference without mentioning the words dynamic zero COVID, which indicates that perhaps that's, a past tense thing.
This would be Sun Chunlan, the Vice Premier of China's cabinet, who said the pathogenicity of the Omicron virus weakens. So that's telling us that the official position is now that they may well be moving into living with COVID status, Jack.
They won't use that phrase, I don't think. But she said they were now facing a new situation with new tasks. You have to sort of wonder how much this is that they've discovered some weaknesses in their control mechanisms during the process. That you never know. You design these things so this means we can keep control of the situation. But when it's tested, and it has been tested with these protests, perhaps they've discovered a few little loopholes that people are exploiting to keep the protests going.
No, there's always that. But I'd also like to think that China's economy has suffered significantly through the pandemic, and with an eye to improving Chinese economic performance. I think that might be driving a lot of these new moves now, Jack.
Well, that's always been the great unwritten treaty, if you like, between the Chinese people and the Communist Party from the Deng Xiaoping era on, was that the people would agree that the Chinese Communist Party could run the place provided they were all getting richer and they're living a much better life, a good life. And that's under threat to some extent by the stalling economy.
Yes, indeed. And look, just one thing that we've noticed, and we noted in your reports from Hong Kong early days during the pandemic, Jack, that there is an aversion among the elderly to get vaccinated in China. Yeah. And that was the case in Hong Kong too, I believe.
Yeah, and for some fairly obscure reasons, to be honest, I think. A great deal of trouble here getting the over 80s vaccinated, and there has been in China as well. But they've now got a program that they say will ensure that the over 80s get vaccinated. We'll have to wait and see whether it works.
Yeah, and getting back to that economic issue, I know Australian manufacturers, having talked to a couple last week, are still suffering from supply issues that are still down, and much of it is down in China, and they're suffering all sorts of problems at the moment. And this is a sort of global issue, but the genesis of it is now China, with its supply routes coming under, or have been under strain for a couple of years. And we're seeing now that some of the big manufacturers are moving away from Chinese manufacturing, and one of the biggest of them all is Apple. And they're moving, their plan is to move a quarter of all iPhone production to India by 2025.
Yeah, as quickly as that. And this is happening on a wider scale. It's hard to know how much is due to COVID and how much is due to manufacturers generally saying, well, look, we don't want all our eggs in the Chinese basket. We want to spread it around a little bit. We spoke a few weeks ago about how much Vietnam is benefiting from that. So this is probably good news for India, Vietnam, Malaysia,
Perhaps not the Philippines. The Philippines, and we should sort of talk about this a little bit more in other programs, but the Philippines sort of misses out on a lot of the great vibrancy of the Southeast Asian economy.
Yeah, it's hard to know why, really, isn't it? I mean, it's full of well-educated people, English-speaking people, but the only thing they seem to produce in terms of foreign exchange are remittances from Filipinos who go and live elsewhere.
go and live elsewhere, and often, as we see in the Middle East, go and labour their bodies out in places like Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, but that's what 40 or 50 years of bad government will give you.
That's right. Yes, you might be better off with French colonists than American colonists. Is that what you're suggesting, Jack?
Well, the Americans haven't. It's the only place they've really done colonialism. They did it pretty badly, and the French were at least better than that. The Brits, we were lucky. The Brits were the best colonialists there were, by and large.
By and large, yeah. I mean, there are one or two gaps there, Jack, in terms of humanitarian issues. Maybe with the Belgians on the top, but the Americans really, in a almost a post-colonial phase, were still running the Philippines, and it just seems to be, the outlier in the Southeast Asian economic drive more than anything else. But that takes us back to the States, Jack, and we're also we were treated to a piece from the Atlantic this week, which just landed in your lap this week, and you flicked me the article. It's a personality study of Ron DeSantis that Ron DeSantis wasn't involved in. So that's one thing. But it did call upon a lot of Republicans, strategists and what have you, who came forward with the view that DeSantis is a pretty dull and uninteresting person, not terribly engaging, and this might be a major problem when he does, or if he does, decide to run in 2024.
Yeah. Quite a few of the Republicans that they spoke to were sort of disillusioned Republicans, former Republicans, if you like. It's a bit like talking to John Hewson or, the late Malcolm Fraser about what's wrong with the Liberal Party. You're going to find plenty,
True enough. But one of the comments that caught my eye, Jack, was that the question was put about Ron, would you want to have a beer with him? That's a very Australian political view, isn't it? Would you want to have a beer with him? And the answer is probably not. But you might not. You might want to have a beer with Trump. I think that's it. I think that's what the article was trying to push the idea of. Very Australian concept.
Well, with Trump, you'd be the only one having the beer because he doesn't touch it.
That's right, yeah.
Karol Markowitz, a Russian emigre, but now United States citizen, who writes for the New York Post, recently moved from New York to Florida, and she says, look, he's pretty good company. The first time she met him was at a dinner, and they sat up till 2 o'clock in the morning drinking good scotch.
That's right. Well, obviously, Ron, drinking. So that was. So she thinks he's has an abundant personality. He certainly seems to be the pick of the Republican Party at the moment. But the article found him to be, and I quote, dour and doesn't improvise particularly well. Now that is an issue, Jack. If you're a politician, you need to come up with the strong line off the cuff very quickly.
You do, although we've had some successful politicians in Australia who you wouldn't have a beer with. I could think of Kevin for starters,
Yeah. Oh, well, Kevin had actually wrote a very engaging piece on the death of Jiang Zemin. Actually, I might flick you the link, Jack. It'll be 3 minutes of your life you'll never get back. But no, it's actually very thoughtful, and China Kevin knows China pretty much better than just about everybody else, or so he thinks, perhaps. But
Well, if you ask him, I'm pretty sure he'll tell you that. At great length.
But significant. Look, he does have significant knowledge. I don't mind giving him a bit of needle, but that he does have significant knowledge of the history of China in the modern era. But look, when DeSantis gets into a primary mode, this is the image I always have is half a dozen of them lined up in a debate, and it's how they react to each other and as well as the questions. And Trump is very good at that. Or he certainly was in 2016 because he was the maverick. He could take the professional politicians out. He might have a little bit more trouble this time, but he does have that gift of the one-liner.
Well, the lines were really good. Lying Ted Cruz, little Marco Rubio, and low energy Jeb Bush. In one night, he killed off all his opponents.
Yeah, he did, and that's what being quick. But also, it played into played into a view within the American public more broadly that, politics, as they knew it, had sort of failed them, and they were looking for someone else. And along came this guy who slapped his opponents down in no uncertain measure, and I think that contributed largely to his victory in 2016.
There was a dissatisfaction with the political establishment on both sides, and he tapped into that very well, and then raised some issues that no one else would talk about, like immigration. So that was the large part of his success. But he was really good, and I think he still is really good at what the Americans call being put on a line. Being walking along beside a line of people who are behind a barricade, shaking hands, all that sort of stuff. And he was very fortunate in 2016 that his opponent, Hillary Clinton, was absolutely hopeless at that.
Well, we've discussed that, and I think politics is probably about 90% luck, Jack, and when you
getting the right opponent's a big thing.
It is a very, very big thing, and that's kind of what happened there. It will be much tougher, as we've discussed, in 2024 for Trump to go, and really the primaries will start in late 2023. He's got some problems, not least of all, he doesn't send out very good invitation lists, Jack. He had a dinner for Kanye West. Kanye West, you call him Ye, you call him Ye.
I call him Ye,
Kanye West. I refuse to do it. I'm not calling him what he wants to be called. I'll call him Kanye
There
West.
His pronouns, Jack.
And he's brought along as his plus one. He's brought Nick Fuentes, Jack, who's just an outrageous Nazi, white supremacist, absolutely, and has the look of the white supremacist, like. Not a very handsome man at all. Generally, the people who talk white supremacy are pretty much genetically challenged, you find, and he ticks a lot of those boxes. The loudmouth Jones was also there. Trump apparently claims that he didn't know Fuentes was going to be there, he said to his staff, because there's been quite a blow up around this, particularly with a lot of Republican senior figures coming out and giving him the rounds of the kitchen over it. Chris Christie was probably the loudest, but so too was the former former Senate Majority Leader, and a number of others, and included Benjamin Netanyahu, Jack, who urged Mr. Trump to renounce the toxic dinner pair, Kanye and his mate Nick Fuentes. On Kanye West, Benjamin said, and that other unacceptable guest, wouldn't even name him, I think it's not merely unacceptable, it's just wrong. And I hope he sees his way to staying out of it, that is Trump, and condemning it, Netanyahu told the media over the weekend in Israel. And there'll be more January 6 stuff, Jack, but there's nothing really bigger than this, because head of the Oath Keepers, Stuart Rhodes, has been found guilty of seditious conspiracy over the January 6th insurrection, and his co-defendant, Kelly Meggs, has also been found guilty. The other four, I think there were all five defendants. There were another three who were subsequently acquitted, but they've been convicted of obstruction of an official proceeding, and all five men are due to be sentenced. Another four have already pleaded guilty. What does Stuart Rhodes get for being found guilty of seditious conspiracy, Jack?
Oh, it's so long ago since they've convicted somebody of this.
Civil War. It was a Civil War law.
I know I'm getting up in the years, but I'm not quite that old.
Well, I think you'd be looking at the maximum is 20, so I think you'd be looking at near enough to that. And the other three who have just been found guilty of obstruction of an official proceeding, I'd put them down for about 4 or 5. We'll let you know when sentencing occurs, listeners. And meanwhile, Jack,
this is not Trump's biggest problem at the moment. Can I just tell you? This was just sent to me this morning.
It's not. I'd certainly agree with that.
This is something that Trump posted on what does he call it? Trump Social.
Truth Social.
Social. So with the revelation of massive and widespread fraud and deception in working closely with big tech companies,
suspend the Constitution,
and the Democratic Party, do you throw the presidential election results of 2020 out that's in capitals, and declare the rightful winner, again in caps?
Yeah.
Or
yeah.
do you have a new election, again in caps, et cetera, et cetera? So he's determined to keep fighting the 2020 election as
Which is not a good, it's not a good
comes
plan.
along. So it's a
Not a good
losing
plan.
move.
He
So-
wanted to suspend the Constitution, Jack, on
Yeah.
Truth Socials,
Yeah.
which is a bold move. And this is what I get to. And I still have that vision of the half a dozen primary candidates standing up, chipping at each other, and answering questions. That's where Trump loses, because
Yes,
he
absolutely.
won't stop babbling about 2020 and how he was done, and a man cheated.
Even the people who liked his policies and generally were prepared to support him, who didn't mind that he was a disruptor of the political establishment, they won't come at being told they've got to refight the 2020 election.
No, indeed not. That is his biggest problem. His delusion is his
Yes.
big problem. Meanwhile, Joe Biden, not delusional at all. He's told coal miners in New Hampshire to learn to code, pick up the laptop, drop
excellent
the pick.
advice. Yeah, excellent advice.
Well, tell me, why is coal down? I mean, US isn't a big exporter of coal.
No.
It generally is designed for domestic consumption, but US coal production is down by 10% in 2019. If we know anything about the mining industry, if things go into decline and mines become unprofitable, they just shut the gate. It looks like there will be some coal miners looking for work very soon, Jack, so maybe that's the answer.
They generally shut the gate after making a half-assed effort to rehabilitate the land they just dug up.
That is one, or sometimes they don't do anything and just drive out the door in a cloud of dust. Yes, look, we have had this issue. The idea of coding has been sort of running through our own politics, and that we every child should learn to code and all this sort of stuff. Yeah. It's not that necessary. If you're not going to work in IT, it's not necessary at all to learn to code. I mean, learning how it works and so forth is probably an area of life that you will get back. Will enhance your knowledge of how this all works. But getting 4,500 blokes, including people in their 55 plus, to drop their picks and matics and go and build an app is probably asking a little bit too much.
Yeah, this has become a sort of a running joke on the US Twitter. The learn to code, because Joe started telling coal miners, etc., to do this some years ago, and people have turned this around now that other people are losing their jobs, like CNN presenters and journalists from various places, and producers and backroom staff. And whenever they're on Twitter complaining about having lost their jobs, the response quickly comes in, you'll just have to learn to code.
Learn to code. That is a bit rude. I believe they're expecting sort of thousands of layoffs at CNN.
Yes.
And they're starting with on-air people, Jack.
They are, yes.
Which is a bit rude too, isn't it? It's not the normal way. Normally you chip off the blokes who've been around for a while, been there 20 years, and you don't want to have to pay them their long service leave and what have you, or you're going to have to deal with it in terms of redundancy. And then they'll get a mess of kids in to do pre-production or to look after the production stuff. But they've actually gone the on-air people. So see you later. I think that's refreshing. That's where you've got to refresh.
Well, they'd already started doing this. They got rid of Brian Stelter, I think because he was hopeless. Chris Cuomo because of sexual harassment allegations.
Yeah, well, that was an easy decision to make.
And because he was acting as a political advisor to his brother, who he was reporting on. But now they've moved into people of otherwise sort of blameless people and getting rid of them as well.
What about the Wolf? Is he still around?
I don't know.
He'd be I'm going to take a stab at his age, but he'd be well into his 70s. Yeah. And I just wonder why, I do look at a lot of media across the world and you see people who have become big names and they just sort of refuse to hustle along when it's retirement age. They fear the relevance deprivation, I think, and that's why they hang in there.
and sometimes media companies keep them on well past their use-by date.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of that too. Yeah. Meanwhile, in Russia, Jack, our very favourite dress up political leader, with the exception of Justin Trudeau.
I've got to pull you up here.
He is the governor. He is the governor. Don't worry about that. But certainly number one in Europe is Emmanuel Macron, and he's come out saying that the Russians basically need some guarantees about their security if they proceed with talks over the Ukrainian conflict. I call it the Ukrainian invasion because that's what it is.
Yeah. Macron, he does have a point in that Russia's not going away and the war is going to end at some stage. And for the end of the war to be anything like successful, everybody's got to get some sort of security out of it. That means the Ukrainians got to get security from another invasion, but the Russians are going to have to get something they can live with as well.
Well,
because the Russians will be there when Putin's gone.
Zelensky says we'll talk once you move past the February borders, once you go back behind the February borders, and we'll talk about the price of reconstructing our country. So that will require a financial penalty for the Russians. I mean, I'm saying these are pretty much non-negotiables for Zelensky, and also we want to proceed with war crime trials. So
they might be non-negotiable for Zelensky, but I don't think they're going to be non-negotiable for the Europeans shivering away in front of their non-existent gas fires.
Well, we'll yet to see where that is. But, I mean, they invaded. Surely they expect to pay a price. They expect to pay a price.
They've already paid a price.
They've already paid a price in men and women, soldiers. They've already paid that price. They're paying the prices. They're paying the price now of new sanctions generally. The new sanction that came in or is due to start this week is selling Russian oil at a cap of $60 a barrel, which is, it's about $30 shy of the international price. And Zelensky is said to be very unhappy about that too, but the West has gone ahead with that sanction. It's still, at $60 a barrel, it's still pretty big profits for the Putin administration. I mean, I just don't know where you go with this. In terms of them all sitting down, I cannot see how they've got really anything in common. The Russians will want the Donbass. The Ukrainians will be well entitled to say, well, we want Crimea. We want Crimea back. And if we don't get it back, we'll fight it and get it back.
I would say the Ukrainians can only fight with the support of Europe and the United States, and I don't think that support will remain open-ended.
I'm sure you're absolutely right about that, but the simple fact of the matter is who started this, and the Russians started this, and they will pay they must pay the heavy price for what is a complete and utter political failure on the part of Vladimir Putin, who remains heavily ensconced in power. Nothing's going to happen there. Maybe we might get some progress if he wasn't there for one reason or another.
Yeah, I don't think he'll be going anywhere very soon.
No, all this stuff.
And for the Ukrainians' sake, they're going to be much better off if the West comes in and does the reconstruction, because the Russians will make a complete pig's breakfast of it.
And Jack, just to keep us going, and I've just got to talk to you about publicity on this, but in the UK there is the Royal Racism Row, which is an alliterative I came up with all on my own. And a black British woman was accosted at a Buckingham Palace function by an 82-year-old woman who's known as the Lady of the Bedchamber, Jack. What do you think she does? She keeps the sheets warm or something?
Oh, I don't know.
Does she? They do have similar roles in in pornography. I do know that. So she's fronted up this woman while feeling her hair, by the way, because the woman had her hair in braids and was fingering it and going, "Where are you from?" And she said, "Well, the charity that she represents is suburban London." So she gave her that the answer first, and then she said, "No, where are you really from?" And she finally told her that she was born in England, and that should have been the end of it, Jack.
It should have.
But she just kept going, didn't she?
I used to work with a Hong Kong Chinese ethnicity bloke, about Sydney born and raised. I think his parents had come over to run a Chinese restaurant in North Sydney, and he was forever being asked, where you're from. So they'd say, Ed, where you from, Ed? And Ed would say, North Sydney, mate. In an accent as like mine, as flat as a shit carter's hat, and eventually they just persisted. He'd say, "Well, when a daddy loves a mummy."
I mean, it is kind of bizarre. And look, let me tell you, Jack, this comes out on the eve of the Netflix series, and I know you'll be watching this. This is Meghan and Harry's Netflix series. And I expect a full report on the show because it's coming out this week.
Well, my wife's taken up to watching Netflix, and I can tell you, I'll give you my take on Netflix right now. Netflix dramas are the same as dramas on network TV, except they've got more sex and swearing.
Yeah, that might be true, but I expect a full report on the Meghan and Harry, because, I mean, this racism row with the 82-year-old woman who's been given the flick, patted on the shoulder and sent off to early retirement at 82.
Well, is that early retirement?
She was expecting to put in a couple of years. And apparently her daughter is also, works for the Royals. And you can tell they've probably traced their family history back earlier than the Windsors. And so she's probably just got a bit of an interest in genealogy. Perhaps her great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather had enslaved the woman she was talking to's great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. So that is all very possible, of course. But it is delightful. It is delightful piece of publicity, and I'm not suggesting anything untoward here, but it's just a delightful piece of publicity for the producers of this Meghan and Harry show that will be appearing on Netflix, I think, starting this week, Jack. So you'll be tuning in.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Wouldn't miss it.
I want a full report.
Nothing I like more than a couple of well-off, privileged people complaining for about 2 hours.
Yeah, that's what you're going to get. And so I expect...
Woe is me. I'm only worth 50 million,
She was in a lot of those dramas you were just talking about. They don't sort of stream now, but she was in a few of those sort of American TV dramas.
Yeah, my son used to watch a thing called Suits that she was in.
Suits. She was in Suits. So look, next episode, perhaps the one after that, we'll get your full report on how you've seen some things we have to do, Jack, not because we want to, but because they're important.
It's a bit like reading Mark Carlton's tweets. I read them so you don't have to.
That's right. Well, I've read them. You read them because I can't, having been given the arse by the great man many years ago on Twitter. Moving over to Iran, we've been talking about the protests. We call them the most courageous people on earth, the protesters in Iran, in Tehran in particular. And there seems to have been, we talked about how the state might respond, and really it had two ways of going. It was basically either ratchet up the repression or tone it down a bit. And it would seem that Iran's Attorney General, who's Mohammad Jafar Montazeri, was at a religious conference over the weekend when he said the morality police was going to be disbanded. He said the morality police had nothing to do with the judiciary and have been shut down from where they were set up. That is because the morality police, they've got a title, Jack. My Arabic or indeed Persian's not great. But it's been shut down now, Jack. That's extraordinary, isn't it?
Well, if it has been shut down, one's always a little bit sceptical about these sort of announcements from the Iranian authorities.
Yeah. So, well, the point that the Attorney General, the Iranian Attorney General, was making was that it falls as part of a. It's not part of the religious element of the government. It runs outside as a sort of runs outside that as a sort of state sort of driven response. But in any event, the protesters is just saying, well, we don't care about that. We're keeping going. So I don't think if it happens, as you suggested, there needs to be some cynicism about it. But protesters are saying it won't be enough for us.
Yeah, well, I think they understand what they're fighting for.
I think they can see some weakness too.
Yep.
But the hijab is a personal choice. That's what the Iranian government is saying now. So there will be none of the nonsense that led to the death in custody of a woman who refused to wear a hijab. A set way, and the response from the protesters is we don't care.
Well, it was only a couple of days ago a rock climber from Iran who competed in. They have this thing, I didn't know this, called competitive rock climbing. You can compete in.
Oh, it's an Olympic event now. Yeah.
Is it? Oh, okay.
No, it has been for a while. Yeah.
Yeah, and she competed without the hijab. And only to find that the house that she came from, her family home back in Tehran, was burned to the ground.
That's awful.
So we have to be just sensibly sceptical about whether the morality police are being put back in the barracks or not.
Yes, but protesters are saying, amongst other things, a revolution is what we have. So that's what they're thinking. They're thinking revolution. Hijab was the start of it, and we don't want anything less but death for the dictator and a regime change.
And I suspect they think they can pull that off.
Pull it off, yes. It's bound to be messy because there is that divide. I mean, the protesters, and I'm cheering them on from the sidelines, they are middle-class city dwellers. And the people who do support the mullahs, by and large, and by and large, the people who support the mullahs are in the rural and regional areas of Iran. All right, but Jack, I just wanted to bring this to you because you're a hard man now when it comes to protesters. You wanted them locked up left, right, and centre.
No, that's not correct at all.
Hang on. A protester who blocked the Sydney Harbour Bridge in a protest over climate change has been sent to prison after a magistrate slammed her for her childish stunts and selfish emotional actions. She's been sentenced for a minimum of 8 after she pleaded guilty to 7 charges, including using an authorised explosive not as prescribed, possessing a bright light distress signal in a public place, and interfering with the safe operation of a bridge. That's the hanging charge as far as I'm concerned. She wept in the gallery before being dispatched for 8 months. I reckon if people appeal, if she's going to appeal, she'll get off that. That seems too harsh to me, Jack.
Well, I looked at it and thought it was well too harsh. I'm never a fan of sending people to jail for anything other much than violent crime, but I am not a fan of sort of self-righteous disruption of other people's lives.
But the problem is, Jack, regardless of what you're protesting about, that and we saw this with freedom rallies and all that sort of stuff. That no matter what the stance, what the movement's about, it is designed to disrupt. Whether it's just closing down city streets or the whole process is disruptive.
Well, protests used to be about getting the point out there. Now the maximum thing is that people say, well, the only way we can make our point is to disrupt everybody else's lives. And it didn't used to be about that. If the disruption was really at a minimum, it was just getting a bit of TV coverage. Now they've decided the only way they can get TV coverage is if they disrupt a whole city by locking the streets up. And I'm not a fan of that.
Oh, it's going to cause a lot of people a lot of hardship through the day. You know, people late to work. I mean, that might be just a very small part of it. There would be people who are involved in emergency situations, just those sort of general family crises that were stuck on roads and so forth. So it's a terribly selfish thing to do. But 8 months in the slammer, I wouldn't have thought that was anywhere near it. And I'm glad you agree.
There was a very amusing case of this in Europe somewhere this week. There was a large, I'm not sure it was quite a symphony orchestra, or maybe it was a chamber orchestra who were performing, and some, climate disruptors wet and glued their hands to the little barrier that's behind the conductor, so he doesn't tumble back into the crowd. Right? And they were going to, two of them, they got there and they glued their hands to this, and they were going to make their point. And much to the amusement and the cheering of the large audience, the producers of the show knew that this barrier that prevented the conductor from tumbling into the crowd could just be lifted up out of the podium and carried out of the room. So they did some chap comes on and does just that. And because their hands are glued to this little barrier, they had no choice but the protesters to follow him meekly across the stage and out into the hallway, where they were left for a couple of hours while the concert.
Yeah, very nice. It is great to see a protest. I mean, I look at some of the cookers who have been locked up for various things over the journey or charged with various things. A lot of them were those sort of COVID-based laws, and I fully accept. In fact, they've been, I think, through the legal services, the community legal services in New South Wales. I think some 2/3 of the 30,000 outstanding charges have been wiped away. But some of this stuff, you know, regardless of where it is, I've seen a few of these cookers before the courts and treat magistrates like garbage and all this sort of stuff, and they end up just nothing, and walking away. So the idea of this woman facing 8 months seemed a bit much to me.
So, but I don't think that's a binary thing. There are different things that can be done between sending someone to jail for a non-violent crime and saying it's okay, just go ahead and do it. You know?
I think what we're dealing with here, if I may be so bold, is we've got a magistrate whose rulings might not and pass at a higher court level, Jack.
Well, any of us who ever had to make lower court rulings know that you're going to get rolled occasionally.
Yeah, I think
trust me on that.
I mean, look, by the time the appeal get up, she probably would have served 2 or 3 months. But anyway, we are still overseas. We're not hanging around in Sydney just yet. But there's big news on in Malaysia, Jack. Anwar, after being 40 or 50 years, probably 40 years, is now going to be the leader of Malaysia.
He has had a few setbacks.
Well, he's done a bit of bird himself. I got one, I think twice for sodomy, I believe.
Yes.
And one of those is a 9-year jail sentence, most of which he served.
Yes.
And then there was another conviction and another long jail sentence. So he now has brought into a coalition. He's from the sort of centre-left, and he's got a sort of shaky coalition going on, Jack, after the elections in Malaysia.
Yeah, the problem in Malaysia is everyone's trying to put together a coalition that needs to include the Islamist parties in Malaysia, but no one wants them to have too much say. So that's the tricky bit of cobbling together the coalition.
Well, the major parties too copped an absolute spanking, but the big loser was 97-year-old former PM, the recalcitrant Mahathir Mohamad. We can call him that now, Jack, and he won't jump up and down, or he can. It's not going to mean anything.
Do you think Paul Keating might have had his dabs on this? You know,
Well, he might have had a bit of a giggle when he read it in the newspaper. Everyone from his party, called the Homeland Movement, did not win a seat, and including old Mahathir himself, who lost his and has left the Malaysian political scene with nary a whimper, hardly a bit of noise at all, as he's disappeared. Fair income. If you think you're going to do things as a political leader in a country when you're 97 years of age, you really do need your head read. That's the first step.
No, you've got to be a senator in the United States or the Speaker of the House for that age.
So the old Soviet Politburo, there'd be a spot there for you too in the 1970s. Look, that's huge news. And I guess the thing that we're wondering about, and we have had a solid read of John Menadew's blog, who writes significantly about international affairs. He's suggested
Pearls and Irritations, and I keep an eye on it. It's a good read.
Yeah, it can be a good read, and
it can also be like a student newspaper for ageing former public servants sometimes. But
it can be a little bit like that too, which is why I don't spend a lot of time on it. But he suggested that the coalition that Anwar has put together is a bit shaky at best, and they might be back next Saturday night to sort it all out, as they used to say in wrestling, Jack.
It's in a fluid state, I think, the politics in Malaysia.
Yeah, fluid state, but good to see. If you're going to say something about Anwar, you're going to say, now, this is a man who will not be deterred easily.
No, he's kept plugging away, shall we say?
So to speak. And in Australia, Jack, we just want to kick off the local study. There's been a bit of shall we say, a commentary on voting behaviour. There are significant shifts in demographics, and I'll go through them in a little while. Voting behaviour, according to Michael Sexton in the Oz, was democracy, and we'll just read this. Democracy is moving against the Liberals in several electoral groups. This is particularly true among young people who often are attracted to the Greens. I'll keep moving. They have never, because young people have never experienced anything other than continuing periods of stable economic growth, and assume this cannot ever be disrupted. That's why they vote for the Greens, according to Michael Sexton. It's the young people, Jack. They're the problem.
Yeah,
I just thought this is absolute nonsense.
Before.
Yeah, I know. Moreover, they have grown up in a society where many members of the community assume the solution to every social problem is substantial government funding, but appear to make no connection between a government's revenue and its expenditure, so that it is accepted without contest, and there can be increased public spending without any increase in taxation. It really is. You know, you would have picked this sort of rhetoric up in the 1970s, that sort of eternal generation gap nonsense, as if you can, pigeonhole young people in that way. I just thought it was just a piece of junk, or that it was a waste of kilobytes in that piece. Look, I did enter the fray last week because, as we discussed last week, the Victorian election result was extraordinary. And you and I talked about things that just weren't present on the Saturday night. I mean, it looked like the Greens had a decent night. Well, they went back to the fray pretty much. They picked up one seat, and really it looks like, and I haven't checked the figures for a few days, but it looks like Dan Andrews will be back with a sort of 54, 55 seats. Same or similar thumping majority he had in 2018. He's had since 2018. And there are clearly some things to be factored in there, although it's too early for us to analyse demographics, age, gender, etc. on that state result. But the federal stuff that's pouring in now is showing that the Liberals have got some really big problems. Chris Mitchell also wrote about it in the Australian Today, and you can have a look at his column as well. Chris tends to think that there'll be cycles, and there are, of course. There are always swings against governments. generally speaking, there are swings against government. Sometimes they're small, sometimes they're ineffectual, and sometimes they blow governments out of the water. But
Chris Mitchell made two good points. I thought one is that every time you think this is the end of a party and that they're in such dire straits that there's no comeback for them, history tells us that's not quite true, that they do come back from there. The other good point is...
There's a few before World War II I can point you to that no longer exist, mate. I mean, it is a bit much to say that the political parties have a forever life, you know.
No,
it's not right.
I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying that he ran through a few times in recent history where people were saying this or that party was finished, and it turned out not to be true. And he's absolutely right to do so. The other good point he made was make sure you read Jack the Insider's column.
He did. That was a very good point. Well done, Chris. Look, we just want to go through there. I mean, look, they're getting about one vote out of 4 from women across the board. Now, and I'm not saying for a moment that can't change, but I'm saying they have got, and I hate the term, they have got serious brand problems right now, and that is it's seen as, you know, like this podcast, Jack, a graveyard of old white men chattering away, and the young people, the millennial vote. So the millennials are defined by those who came of age, who basically cast their first ballots either in 2001, 2004, 2007. And that's the millennial group. Now, that millennial group was next to nothing in 2004, but at that time, in that demographic group, about 42% of them voted for the coalition. Now, in 2022, we're seeing that down to about 26%. And again, it shows you that it's changeable and it can change. But at this stage, it's looking very, very solid. That demographic, you know, you would expect.
But in that period, in 2004, it was 42% for the coalition. I've not seen the figures, but I can tell you that from Labor Party people, they tell me in 2007, the great Kevin 07 election, they swept the floor with that demographic. Then they lost it again.
Yeah, look, if you want to talk 2007, then you really did have a bit of a shift in that demographic that Howard had treated as his own and was very, very good at keeping it in that 55 plus. And you see a significant change from that sort of 55 plus away from Howard. I'm just going
and
off.
Chris Mitchell's point was that happened in 2007, and you know, not very many years later. 6 years later, it swung back the other way.
I'm not saying that there won't be swings. What I'm saying is that this is a long trend, and that as the millennials get into the system, and by the next federal election, they'll make up 45% of all voters. And if you've got that differential where you've got basically 1 in 4 of that huge chunk voting Liberal, and with the other profound problems that they've got, including that they, you know, when people are voting for right-wing parties, they're not preferencing the Libs, not to any degree, not to the same degree, you know, the sort of discipline that the Green votes and other minor right-wing parties come back to Labor. That's why Labor had 17% of their vote.
That the minor parties on the right are incredibly they're kind of
they're nuts. Really, they're nuts, Jack. Just come out and say it, mate.
I'm trying to find a polite way of saying they're a bit, you know, a sandwich short of a picnic, you know.
Nutty, chewy,
whereas the Greens are a little bit nuts, but they're reasonably disciplined nuts.
Well, Fon, you know, Fon's a good example. I mean, it's about 65-35. You know, so Labor doesn't lose that much on the Fon vote, and that tells you also that some of the Labor votes have seeped to Fon. You know, but yeah, look, the numbers aren't good. They definitely need to get more women into the party. As I said, Peter Dutton might have to wear his baseball cap backwards and talk to the dudes. If they don't make changes, they can't expect to arrest this, and they really do. I think the argument about moving to the left or the right is really a nonsense. What they need to do is get better candidates that appeal to the demographic that they're losing.
What they need to
and
do
let the broad church sort it out.
Is to get better candidates who are really interested in winning government. That's the mistake the Labor Party made for 30 years, was to elect people who wanted to project ideological purity, and they got rid of a lot of those and pre-selected people who actually wanted to win an election.
Look, it's a decent point when they put forward sort of religious, shall we say, fundamentalists, when they put forward in Victoria, sort of putting, and in the federal sphere, putting together people whose religious beliefs are that far from the mainstream that they really can't be considered as genuine candidates. So I don't know where those people are getting thrown up from. We know the Victorian Liberal Party is full of it opened its doors to sort of religious fundamentalism. I hesitate to use the word extremism. And that's part of that, part of that pre-selection process is going to deliver these people in there. I take your point, but I think what the worst thing the party can do now is have that left or right debate, because that will further tarnish the brand. And it's something the commentariat loves to do. But it let the broad church sort it out, get some younger, ambitious candidates who want to get in for public service, not because they want to push some ideological barrow or some sort of spiritual barrow.
Yeah, I don't think an individual's religious beliefs matter much at all. People don't really care about that. What matters is
they do. They do if they're extreme, mate. They do if they're extreme, and they do if they're if they've got a profound anti-abortion view. You're just not going to get women voting for you, younger women, younger professional women. The figures there are 1 in 6, Jack. So it's about 16% of that vote. And they won't vote for religious nutters. They just won't. So, you're going to have to purge these people from your party. And it's not going to be very pleasant, but you've got to do it. You're going to have to do it because they're continually throwing up awful candidates, half of which have to be disendorsed during a campaign because they haven't done the haven't done the research on them.
Mm.
So that's what they've got to do. And I was watching Jane Hume on Sky News on election night, and she's been pushing hard for this. Whether they have a quota for advancing women into the party or not, they keep talking about this, but they never do anything about it. Or whether they just sort of get around to just approaching the right people to represent them, or to become new candidates. We're going to find we're probably going to have this similar discussion around March of next year, mate.
Yeah, well, I'm an agnostic on quotas, but it really is about finding people who don't have any particular. It's not about chasing particular religious views or particular ideologies. You've got to find people who want to win.
Yeah, and for the right reasons, I think, because they are devoted to public service rather than pushing some barrow. What does all this mean for the Voice, Jack? And we'll get to the Nats in a minute and how they dropped out, and this rather spectacular response from Noel Pearson. We've got a poll. You've got a poll of 3,000 on the Voice there, Jack.
Yeah, from a company called 89 Degrees East. I think they poll for the Labor Party by and large.
Right. Yeah, not coming across them.
62% yes. Of that, 30% strong yes. 32% what they call a soft yes. That's a yes but maybe, and 20% no. And on the face, you'd say 62, 20. That's it's going to win pretty easily. But I must say I didn't find that poll all that comforting. I think that I don't think this is any better than a 50-50 chance of succeeding the referendum.
Well, I'll pose another question to you, Jack, and we'll do the Nats now. We may as well, right? The Nats have come out against it. And Jacinta Price is a senator from the CLP, which is not quite the National Party, but it may as well be.
So, fellow traveller.
Yeah, and she was the spokesperson while David Littleproud stood to one side, which was something that caught the eye and the tongue of Noel. I mean, it was a terrible piece of leadership from Littleproud. But Jacinta Price was the spokesperson in explaining why the National Party would not be part of, or would not be supporting the Voice referendum. Now, I'll put Jacinta Price to one side for a minute. We haven't had a referendum for a long time in this country, Jack. Maybe this idea that bipartisanship has to be in place for a referendum to be assured doesn't stand anymore.
Oh, I don't think that was ever a requirement.
No, it was never a requirement, but the shall we say the prevailing wisdom was that if you don't have support, if you don't have bipartisan support from the two major parties, then the referendum would almost certainly get rolled.
Yeah, no, I've never been convinced that was a precondition of success. What you've got to do is to take the great body of the people with you, and I don't think that what the politicians in Canberra decide necessarily carries the great bulk of the people with you.
Yeah, look, they're going to be. There's a great big concert will be on the ABC, Jack. Those are the sorts of things that are going to catch the eye. There's not a lot of information out there. I know Linda Burney dropped a fair amount of detail last week to the public, but these things are still being talked about and discussed. Let's get to Jacinta Price for a minute. Noel Pearson was particularly scathing of her, of course, but the final comment he made in regard to her was the one that got me, and that was he did not discern in her conduct in public life that she had any answers to deliver practical outcomes for Indigenous Australians. I think that's always going to be the knock on her. She did after Noel gave her the rounds of the kitchen, and Little Proud, she did complain that she was being bullied, Jack, and that seems to be a bit of behaviour that she needs to get out of her practice. She every time she gets attacked, she claims she's being bullied. And I think she needs to knock that on the head. But for the life of me,
well, if she wants to be a politician, you've got to have a thicker skin than that.
Well, and she claimed that she'd received thousands of calls of support, but then she received other calls of death threats and what have you. And she basically called Noel Pearson a bully. Now, and she did this with the Fitz interview. Without releasing the tapes.
Well, he can put up with that, and she can put up with a little bit of bullying. As far as I'm concerned, if you're going to be in politics, and they both,
it's just rhetoric. It's not bullying. I mean, don't use the term because it's not right.
Well, I don't care.
It's just argy-bargy. And if you're not up for it, you can take your bat and ball and go home.
That's exactly right. Both of them can take their bat and ball and go, because they're both in politics. So if they can't put up with it, they can take their bat and ball and go home. I read the Karma Langton report yesterday. Have you read that? I don't know how many pages. It's quite long. And I've got to say that my scepticism about whether the referendum will pass was increased after reading that report, because I think the more that kind of detail gets out into the public, the less chance of success there is.
What do you mean? So be specific. I haven't read the report.
It's too complicated. I read it and thought most of this is not going to work.
So this is the stuff that Bernie released during the week, is it?
Yep.
And this has come from the desk of Marcia Langton.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I better get myself up to speed on that, Jack. Look, I think the question that should be put to Jacinta Price now and forevermore from journalists is, what have you done in terms of practical reconciliation? What have you done? You've been a deputy mayor of Alice Springs, and while that might not be the highest position in the country, you have had a leadership role here. So what have you done? And more importantly, what would you do? And we want to sit back and we want to respectfully listen to what you might do about delivering practical reconciliation in Australia, reducing the hardship of people living in remote Australia. I'd just like to hear. We'd sit back because basically we've been trying to deal with this with open hearts for a long time, and there's been a lot of money wasted for no great outcomes. So
Yeah, well, I would agree with asking Jacinta Price that question, and I think that question should be asked fairly generally of people who work in that area.
yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't know if you ask Lydia Thorpe, mate, you might never escape alive.
Yeah, well, that's probably right. Well, her boyfriend might come around and give you a visit.
That's right. Well, ex-boyfriend, come on. Let's
Oh,
be
is he
fair.
ex-boyfriend? Now,
They're still friends, Jack. They're still
Still
friends.
friends. Okay, yeah.
They're still friends. All right, now we've got to deal with this. It's a really unpleasant thing. The Lehrmann trial, it's now been pulled up by the ACT DPP. The announcement was that the retrial would not proceed due to to a risk to the complainant, Brittany Higgins, risk to her health. And Jack, you asked me what I thought of it. You'd been expecting something like this to occur at some point, and you asked me what I thought, and I just thought, well, this is one matter that should have gone to trial. This is one where we just needed an outcome, but we're not going to get one.
Yeah, I didn't think it would go to trial in the end, or that there would be a retrial. Because I don't believe that it was. I didn't believe, and I still don't believe that it was possible for him to get a fair trial. And I thought that eventually the court would come around to the same view. There was an application that was meant to be heard last Friday at 10 o'clock, which was media embargoed, and we still, as far as I know, don't know what was in that application or what evidence they were going to call. I believe that there is an application before the court to remove that media embargo so we can find out what was in it. But the DPP decided to move before that hearing started and to discontinue the case. I don't think he was going to get a fair trial, and I think that was largely because there was a public trial, if you like, a mob trial in the media between the time the charges were laid and before the charges were laid and the time of the trial.
But it would have. But wouldn't you believe that he had received a fair trial
No.
in the first trial?
No,
And,
I don't think the first trial should have gone on.
And that the jurors went, if not for a bit of juror misconduct, they would have come up with a verdict.
No,
Guilty or not guilty.
I don't think that he had a fair opportunity in the last trial, and he certainly wouldn't have in the next one, in my view.
Well, what would have been different?
The statements outside the court immediately afterwards.
And that was where Brittany Higgins spoke?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. So you believe that was an issue?
And the not just her statement, but the reporting thereof.
Yeah, I'm not so sure, Jack. I mean, basically, why can't we do this again? And look, I understand that there may be some mental health issues for the complainant arising, but we go to a judge-only trial and get it done. I mean, I cannot understand how we cannot have an outcome here, whether it's guilty or not guilty. We need to go through the process.
I don't think a judge-only trial is available in the ACT.
Oh, well, that's a problem for them, isn't it? Yeah. I look at ACT justice in recent times at the lower level, Jack, and it's pretty ordinary stuff, let me tell you. They bail people out who should not be bailed. And there's a sense of really almost a sort of, justice is well, there's one bloke who allegedly assaulted a woman, and he continues to get bail. They finally locked him up. I won't get into that now, but it's left me wondering about ACT, the ACT courts more generally. So I didn't know that. I mean, overall, we know where this is going to go. This is going to go in the civil courts.
I think that would be a mistake from anyone who brings the matter into the civil courts.
There's been no statement from Bruce Lehrmann in that regard, although there is some talk of it. Whether that's true or not, who knows? But Brittany Higgins is bringing an action against, according to the Australian Today, is bringing an action against two federal ministers, Jack.
Yeah, and there might be some sense in that for her, but look, it's a mess. The
It
whole
is a
thing's
mess, isn't it?
a very messy situation. It's terrible for Brittany Higgins. It's terrible for the
Lehrmann,
accused
yeah.
as well. His life's being ruined.
They're both being
I've
ruined.
got no idea whether he's guilty or not. I wasn't there, but his life's a mess now. And
Well, so is hers. I mean,
the
that's,
discontinuance of the case doesn't do her any favours.
No.
Doesn't do him any favours. And really, I think the reason for the discontinuance, the blame for that, isn't on the justice system. It's on the way, particularly the media reported it right from the beginning.
get to that in a minute. This is what Brittany Higgins said outside the court, Jack. This you believe this is of concern.
Yep.
This is what she said in part. This is the reality of how complainants in sexual assault cases are treated. Their lives are torn apart. Their friends and families are called to the witness stand, and the accused has the legal right to say absolutely nothing. There's nothing in what she said there is a presumption of, or for mine, goes against the presumption of innocence.
That was precisely what the judge in the case counselled against. I'm not sure whether she made it was an order of the court, but it was certainly a strong advice from the bench that no one should go outside the court and talk about it. And unfortunately, the complainant did go outside and talk about it straight away. And I think that was going to take away any real prospect of another trial.
Okay, now look, when we talk about how the media dealt with this, and it really is just awful. I mean, there are a number of people there who you just wonder why they're still in work. And I'll start with Lisa Wilkinson, who took Higgins under her arm. Her husband too, Fitzsimmons. Basically, there was some discussion about a book being written and an advance being negotiated by Fitzsimmons, who was sort of acting as a commercial publishing agent. Jack, and
it's a nice old fee too, Jack. You're a member of an old man from the publishing trade and an author yourself. I hope you're getting that one.
No, well, look, 2025's not out of the question, mate, for an agent. As a standard fee on all an artist's income, be that a writer or a musician or whatever. It's 2025.
And I think the figure mentioned was 325 for the book, wasn't it?
I think there was a fairly substantial advance. I don't know that it was ever actually finalised, but there would have been publishers throwing their caps into the ring and that sort of order. Part of the problem was, as I understand it, and the Australian ran a piece on this on the weekend, written in part by Janet Albrechtsen, and Clive as well, and they were saying that there were concerns about the police about Brittany Higgins' evidence and her willingness to work within a criminal investigation, and that seems to me to be very, very marked by or checkered by the involvement of journalists around that time. So rather than go to police, she was basically going to media personalities, and it was almost like the police reporting was secondary, and showing willingness to be open with police as well.
Yeah, it was. I just don't think it was well handled at all. Judge Lucy McCallum made the point after Lisa Wilkinson's speech at the Logie Awards that the distinction between an allegation and a fact seemed to have disappeared entirely.
Well, that alone set back the trial. What, 3-4 months?
Yes.
So this matter could have been resolved.
So what I'm saying is that the speech at the Logie set it back 3 or 4 months, and in my view, the statement outside the court killed it off altogether.
All right, and that was directly after the mistrial. Yeah. After the mistrial. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I just think it's a completely unsatisfactory situation.
Yeah,
it's
a terrible situation for everybody involved, as far as I'm concerned. But put the blame where it belongs, and I think the media should have it should be a look in the mirror time, a real good hard look.
One or two celebrity journalists. Yeah, I agree. I agree. All right. 50 years since the election of the Whitlam government, Jack.
I remember it well. What were you doing 50 years ago?
Well, I was just a young lad. I did have my It's Time badge. I don't know where that is today, but I used to wear that around the place. Bearing in mind, Jack, I was just 10. So I don't think people were paying too much attention to my views, Jack. It was a major social event in Australian history. It's true also that it was a government that lacked a lot of talent across the board, and was governed in part, at least, by time servers who'd been in opposition for a very long period of time. There was some new talent coming through. I think everyone acknowledges that the final budget handed down by the Whitlam government by Bill Hayden, the one that was ultimately not passed through the Senate, bringing on the constitutional crisis and ultimately the sacking of the Whitlam government, was a good budget. And of course, Paul Keating, I think, was Minister for Aviation in that latter part of that government.
For a couple of weeks, yeah.
And I see you've got a little note here. It wasn't long. It wasn't long at all. But he said at least they got out of Melbourne and Sydney sewered, Jack, and that was one thing that basically we can say about the Whitlam government. But I'll go a step further, mate. You know, Woolloomooloo wasn't sewered before
I did
Whitlam.
know that.
Yeah, you did, and so I mean, we wouldn't perhaps put it high on the list of the Whitlam government's achievements, but sewering our cities probably should be considered a pretty good and decent thing.
Yeah, an engineering mate of mine used to always tell me that at least they got that done. You know,
they got a lot of stuff
because the election of the government did change Australia.
There's no doubt about that.
In a whole lot of social ways, it changed Australia. But the government itself, although it had some great ideas, was a bit of a shambles. At least until Bill Hayden was appointed treasurer.
That was, and of course, it wasn't allowed to. He wasn't allowed to hand that budget down. That was considered to be a very, very good one, and that's probably why Fraser wouldn't let it through. But Jack, I do recall the words of Charlie Watts, now deceased, the Rolling Stones drummer. He said he didn't enjoy his time in Australia the first time they visited, and I think that was about 1966. But when the band returned, and he returned with it, in the sort of post-Whitlam age, he said the country had sort of grown up quite suddenly.
They were here in 1973, I think, is my recollection.
It would have been, I'm going to say, 1966.
Kooyong tennis courts, I think.
1973, and that he found the country much changed for the better. I direct anyone who's got an interest in this, have a listen to Noel Pearson's speech at the memorial for Gough Whitlam, where he talks about conservatives being like Michael Palin and John Cleese in Life of Brian. What have the Romans done for us lately? And he puts that on Whitlam. What has this old Roman done for us lately? It's a beautiful speech. Check it out on YouTube. Jack, sport, the World Cup, the Aussies. The Aussies did all right. I think they're probably a bit lucky to get through into the final 16, but they got in there, and then they got beaten 2-1 by Argentina. And
an English mate of mine at the start of the tournament, we were drawing our lots in the suite, and I think I drew Wales, and one of the other guys drew Aussie, and I said, well, he's not that much better off than me. And Will, my English friend, said, well, they're Aussies, mate. They'll be well drilled, they'll be hard fit, and they'll have a real crack at it, and they just might get out of the group. And that's pretty much what happened.
Yeah, they did extremely well. We've got some
haven't got enough good players, but
we'll get to one of our reader letters in a minute as to how the game of soccer, as we call it in this country, how it expands and develops. or do they just let this through? There are major problems in soccer development, but I just want to get you. There's some mouth-watering games coming our way very, very soon. Not least of all, England v France, Jack.
Agincourt again.
Yes, coming up this week. I think Wednesday night or
Saturday night, I think.
Well, it'll be Saturday morning, I suppose. Our way it'd be about 2:00 in the morning. I thought it's a little bit earlier than that. They still haven't quite got through the group stuff yet. It may well be, of course. Well, had we beaten Argentina, we would have played the Netherlands, who look to be in fairly good form. The Brazilians aren't far away either. They haven't. Well, they have qualified into the.
The Brazilians
They haven't played their playoff yet. Yeah.
The Brazilians look like they'll get Japan in the quarterfinal.
Yeah, and the Argentinians, if they beat the Netherlands, may have to play. Oh, no, I think I've got that wrong. Brazil may have to play Argentina as well, Jack.
That would be in the semi, I think.
That would be in the semi. That's right. Yeah. So I've gone through the.
The Japanese, I wouldn't underestimate them. They're pretty good.
The Japan have been very, very good. Had some flat moments, but they've been very, very good overall. Look, I still think England might. Still think England might just come over the top, but they'll have to beat a very good French side. So for me, France and Brazil are the sides to beat. But we're getting down to getting almost down to that final 8 now, Jack. And I just want to talk. A man we'll know pretty well from his musings over the years, Jack. This is a reader and listener. Bassman, and calls himself Bassman because he's a bit of a muso, plays. In fact, he in his letter today, he attached a little photo of himself surrounded by speakers, and he was having a bit of a complaint about the cost of sport at junior level for his children. And he quoted from the Sydney Morning Herald today. He said, however, soccer club officials warn the high costs of playing the game, up to $2,000 a season at some junior clubs, means some kids who want to may be denied the chance. Football Australia chief James Johnson has conceded costs associated with elite junior pathway system are too high. Socceroos coach Graham Arnold called for an in-depth review of Australia's soccer pathways this week and said he fears for the future if Australia's young soccer talent aren't given greater opportunities and junior teams continue to struggle with limited resources. So there are problems with the game, and now you would think it's the time to resolve them. Otherwise, this has all been for naught.
Good to hear from Bassman again. Remember reading him on your blog when that existed.
Yes.
I think the problem that soccer or football has in Australia is that they need more money to come in at the top from the TV rights and the sale of shirts or whatever it is, because that's what's led to success for the other codes, for the NRL and for the AFL in particular, that they've been able to use that money to build grassroots sport. And soccer's never really had that level of money in Oz to do that.
Well, it just doesn't have the broadcast rights. So if we look at the competition here, it certainly gets some broadcast rights out of it, but it doesn't have huge following.
Not enough money. Yeah.
It is probably after rugby union. In line with rugby union, the code, the football code that has the biggest international stage. But look, I think Baseman was talking about cricket too, and if you happen to find your son or daughter is getting into that elite junior pathway, then it becomes a very expensive exercise for the parents. Just kitting a kid out with cricket gear, helmet, bat, pads, all that sort of stuff. That's going to cost you the best part of $3,000. I mean, you can't buy a bat that's any good these days under $600. You're going to probably pay $1,000 for a bat. So it's very, very difficult for people. I mean, if you're, this is why we say, there's a kid who's come from an elite private school and so forth. Well, it's the economics of this means that we're finding a lot of kids can't, their parents can't afford putting them into that sort of elite junior pathway.
But if you want soccer to grow and to be successful, say it's AFL or NRL, you look at what the AFL have done with Auskick, which is a tremendous success, and see what that they can provide a good pathway for a hell of a lot of kids to get a start in it. And then they have the academies on top of that where you give everyone a chance to play for a while, and then the various clubs and regions have their academies where you take the better players out of that group and give them a hand. And that's what you've got to do. I just don't think soccer's got the money to do that at the moment.
Oh, look, there is, we've got the various state sporting bodies who can look after, the kids at that elite level. For me, it's not the junior development side that soccer's junior development's actually pretty good. It's the senior game in a very competitive, very competitive environment. And look, part of the problem, Jack, is if you had young children, would you take them to a game featuring the Sydney Wanderers?
No.
Or indeed the Sydney, the other league side, the other Sydney side, with their, where you've got a few people offering, Nazi salutes and what, it's just there's still that element in that game that needs to be removed, and you won't get big crowds while those people are there.
Yeah, Frank Lowy, when he was there, did some great work to try and, when he was head of the Football Federation of Australia, did some great work to try and stamp that out, but it hasn't been entirely successful.
All right, moving over to the cricket, Jack. England scored 500 in Rawalpindi, and the first day of a test.
On the opening day of a test match. Never been done before.
Never been done before, and it turned out to be a bit of a road.
Michael Vaughan, I noticed, was full of compliments for the English batting on day one. And on day two, he was complaining the pitch wasn't fit for test purposes.
Day two, with Pakistan 3 for 400, he said the pitch was a joke.
Yeah, I did enjoy that.
Yeah, look, it was just awful. I mean, and the big name players. So Joe Root didn't get the 100. I think Stokes got a few, but he didn't get 100. And just hundreds have been scored like not T20, somewhere between T20 and ODI rate.
I think the two of the four Centurions on the first day, that was their first century.
Yeah, and they just blitzed them. So the ball's absolutely doing nothing. I mean, Australia played Pakistan in Pakistan just recently for the first time in many, many years, and we found the same sort of thing. The wickets are they're too defensive. They don't want the Pakistan crowd to watch the Pakistan team lose, and so they're building these roads, making these roads. They need to fix that up.
They prefer a draw.
It's no way to promote cricket, and poor old Jimmy Anderson, the old Rolls Royce there. They had to drag him out and bowl out, but he wouldn't bowl bumpers. That's asking too much.
Yeah, no, there was a great comment on. I was following this a bit on Crick Info. When I can't get a screenshot of the game, I'll sometimes have Crick Info in a little box up in the corner of my computer, and they decided. I think they set the Pakistanis 330 to get in 100 overs. Which is kind of doable on a track like that.
Yeah, haven't got the score. Haven't caught the score yet.
And Ben Stokes, who I think is a great cricketer and captain, came out and decided, well, we're getting nothing out of the wicket. Let's try and bang a few in short and see if we can't get a few out. And they got a couple out. And one of the commenters said, why isn't Jimmy Anderson bowling? Because they normally open with him. Great new ball bowler. And the comment came back, bumpers from Jimmy. It'd be like asking a Ferrari to carry scaffolding,
Yeah, and Jimmy, it must be said, he's nearly 40, Jack.
He still bowls well, though.
Look, absolutely, when conditions suit, but that's not suiting. That doesn't suit him at all. No, you'd be better off playing another quick, to be honest. Anyway, Australia won the first test against the Windies. I thought the Windies stuck pretty manfully to the task against a very, very good side. I thought the wicket was a decent one for Test cricket. A lot of these drop-in test wickets now in Perth, Melbourne, Adelaide, etc. They don't wear much, so you don't get a lot from the spinner. But then Lyon popped up with 628 yesterday, and
hasn't he gotten better? He just gets better as he goes along.
His ball groupings, mate, are astonishingly good. So they showed 2 overs of his bowling, and there was a little mark. It was a foot scuff from a right arm from a right arm bowler at the other end. It'd be the last step of the foot from him before he gets off the wicket, and it just scuffed up a patch, probably half the size of a foot. And he, with 12 balls, he hit that spot 12 times. That's handkerchief stuff, and that is
the handkerchief line comes from Bill O'Reilly. He used to put a handkerchief on the practice wicket.
Yeah, and so there you go. They use boots and all sorts of things.
Warney used to put a ball down and bowl until he hit the ball.
Yeah. Lyon's control is becoming extraordinary. He's also getting the variations now. Look, I thought also, Head just picking up a couple of wickets. He actually broke some partnerships that were starting to look a little bit difficult for him. And just what a hell of a cricketer he's become. He came out, got the 99, really got Australia's scoring rate accelerated. We can't forget Marnus Labuschagne with 200 and 100 and Steve Smith with 200 not out. But he's just looking a very, very good cricketer, the South Australian captain.
And Steve Smith with 4 great catches as well as the 100.
Didn't he feel well in the slips to Lyon in particular? All right, now we just want to talk, because we're about to wrap things up. We do want to have a bit of a chat about Twitter, the Elon Musk, what he's talking about now, and the whole business with the Biden laptop, Hunter Biden laptop, and all that sort of stuff. There was a bit of stuff that came out from Matt Taibbi, a journalist who's obviously got the ear of Elon Musk, but unfortunately the idiot can't run a thread on Twitter, Jack.
It was a bit hard to follow.
It was a bit hard to. He was going off on all sorts of tangents. We want to have a good look at Twitter under Elon Musk, and we're going to put that into our conversations next week. The other thing we're going to do before Christmas, Jack, is talk about our political insults. So that's on the agenda for next week. But also from Twitter, Jack, it was a rough time for Germany.
Yeah, this is a comment from an American tweeter. Unusual for Americans. They've all been following the World Cup because the USA team is, until the last one.
They're pretty good, actually, yeah.
They're pretty good. And his comment was, it was a rough day for Germany. Eliminated from the World Cup. It's a new Indiana Jones trailer out, and a black man is now the Nazi comms director. I think that might be a reference to our friend Ye.
Yes, indeed, that might be. I won't call him Ye. I won't call him Ye at all. But look, yeah. So we're going to get onto that Twitter discussion. That's actually very good. The Germans, I think they were thinking about things besides football, Jack. I think that's what. That's what the hardheads in the football world are saying, that they've gone in there expecting the protests and so forth. Didn't happen, and they just weren't concentrating on the footy.
Well, I think they thought they would stroll out of their group pretty easily and then get serious when the knockout stuff came, and they didn't quite get out of the group.
They didn't last. You'd think they'd be, gung ho after getting rolled out. In the group stage. Yeah.
Well, the group stage has been terrific, I've got to say. It's been really good football to watch. It's a measure of how much more even the competition now is, that some of these smaller nations play pretty well.
Oh, the Africans have always been good, and now they're really just exploding, Jack. So the game is. Well, it's just a wonderful tournament to watch. If you look at the number of people watching, it's line ball with the Olympics as to what is the biggest bread and circuses show in the world. But
Qatar aside, the host nation, every other team showed some promise, showed some real good stuff.
Yeah, indeed. All right. So, thank you very much for your time today, Jack. We've covered just about everything, and we've been to China, all the way around the world, and then to Australia. And we just want to let our listeners know, if you like what you're hearing or you don't, drop us a line, ask us some questions, and we'd love to get back to you on all of those. We do have a few listener requests that we're dealing with at the moment. You can hit me up on Twitter, and my DM's always open, or you can hit up the show's email address, which is the conditional release program at gmail.com. Drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you. See you, folks.
Cheers.